Sometimes you're telling a story in your D&D games that just naturally puts pressure on your players to act. Maybe a horde of orcs is advancing on an unaware village and the party has to get there in time to help them defend. Or maybe the party's competing with a rival band of adventurers to find a powerful artifact that can sway the course of history. But then again, maybe you're just exploring an ancient ruin in search of riches. There might not be a clear story element that's driving a sense of urgency or suspense, but you still might want to add a bit of tension to the game to make it a little spicy. In this video, I'm going to share a few tricks I've used in my games that you can drop in as needed to highlight those tense scenes. Almost as tense as when I call for a Save versus Justin. Of course, not every scene in your game needs to have your characters sweating the outcome. In my games, I like a mix of exploration, heroic action, and comedic relief. But there's times when I want to highlight a consequence of a key action the party's taking, or a decision they're making. Or maybe it's just a showdown with a longtime rival. Description and storytelling is important, but there are several physical things you can bring to the table that can elevate that encounter just a little bit more. The first trick is pretty simple, and you might already have what you need. A dice cup. We usually use dice trays at our table, or dice towers if we're feeling saucy, but there's a weight that gets added to a dice roll when you drop the die into your cup and rattle it around and then slam it down on the table. The trick is in not lifting the cup right away. Instead, you tap the cup, or maybe drum your fingers on the bottom, talking more about the consequences of the roll and maybe peeking under it liar's dice style to get a glimpse of the result, before offering your players a deal. You see a troll come charging down the mountainside, howling and swinging a dead tree like a club. Your foot slides out behind you as you realize you're backed up to the edge of a trail with a sharp drop. It's clear the troll is going to slam into you and send you flying off the cliff. This is his strength roll. Will you try to hold your ground with a strength roll of your own? Or will you choose to slide down the cliff, trying to control your fall for half damage? That's a proactive trick you can improvise and pull out on the fly, as scenes like this naturally emerge during your game. The next trick is a little more reactive to the pacing of the game at the table, and you might already have what you need for this one as well. A sand timer. Now, I'm all for careful thought and planning by the players. Part of the fun for us is seeing how the characters can use their abilities together to solve a puzzle, or maybe set up a nice combo during battle. But sometimes, to mix things up, maybe there shouldn't be time to stop and metagame. Maybe you need to make a decision or get something done and you need to do it now. Slamming down a sand timer can really get everybody to focus. Or failing that, add an element of frantic chaos. Especially if there's a consequence tied to that last grain of sand falling to the bottom. As you make your way to the entrance of the ruined castle, you notice an orc on watch in one of the towers. He calls out, and at first you think he spotted you, but then you realize he's calling out to a returning band of orcs behind you. What do?
We can take them. Let's just ambush them.
No, let's hide and let them pass, and then while the guard's distracted, sneak around the side. But guys, I've been super excited to try out this new illusion. It involves were-rabbits.
No, leap out and strike.
Could it be more like fire-breathing were-rabbits? Well, I could also just cast Fireball. You have 30 seconds to decide on a plan. If that sand runs out, the orcs will have advantage to spot you. What's nice is you can get a set of sand timers that includes multiple time limits, so you can kind of adjust how rushed the party should feel depending on the scene. Adding the tension of a countdown for your players can be exciting, but why should they have all the fun? Maybe 2 clocks is better than 1. I've used a chess clock like this one in a few boss fight scenes, and just pulling this thing out from behind your GM screen can raise a few eyebrows. The way these work is that each clock is set with an equal amount of time. When the GM pushes the button on their side, the timer starts counting down for the players. They have to describe their actions and resolve their roles before they can pass the turn back to the DM by slamming down their own button. Apparently, slamming is a common theme in these tricks. The GM then quickly describes the actions for the bad guys and resolves their roles before passing it back to the players. The orcs spot you. What do?
I unshoulder my axe and stand my ground, pointing to the orc that will surely fall first.
I tune my lute, pluck a few strings, and try to look super confident. That's bardic inspiration for you, my friend. Guys, I don't think we have time to mess around. I cast mage armor. I'm definitely going to need mage armor. The guard in the watchtower sounds a horn. You can hear it answered in the distance by a war cry. The band of orcs near you charges, rusty swords coming at you like meat cleavers. One of them hits the dwarf, knocking the wind out of him for 5 points of damage.
I grunt from the blow, but then draw in breath and release a war cry of my own as I wade into them, axe swinging. I miss. Probably on purpose, to set myself up for greater glory.
Well, seeing how clearly inept these orcs and dwarf are, I spent some time mocking one of them, viciously. In fact, hold on, I've prepared a short speech for a situation just like this. No, fireball. Everything is fireball. The goal would be to try to resolve the scene or battle before the time runs out. Once one of the clocks runs out, this little flag will fall, and when it does, maybe that triggers some kind of event. Either something bad for the side that ran out of time, or maybe something good for the other side. Now you're probably thinking, but Justin, usually there's a bunch of players and just one GM. Of course the players are going to run out of time first. True, so if you want to make it more fair, you could always start the players with more time on their clock. Let's say you gave yourself 5 minutes and your player's 15. The flag's going to drop in 20 minutes or less, which is pretty fast for a D&D combat. Of course, that may not be the signal that the combat is over, just that something new or exciting is getting added to the scene.
The dwarf steps forward towards the last remaining orc. Hold, my friends, this one is mine. Let us settle this one-on-one, steel on steel.
Oh, what does that mean?
The orc smiles as the gate behind you opens and a horde of his best friends start flooding out of it toward you. Infiltrating the ruins will have to wait for another day because now you're running for your life. But maybe there's a scene you don't want to be frantic. You want the opposite. Instead of an adrenaline rush, you want that scene to slow down and shine a spotlight on every little detail as tension mounts around some kind of explosive conflict. Maybe something similar to a shootout in the dusty streets of a spaghetti western, where the camera zooms in on all those small details like a killer's eyes, or a bead of sweat, or maybe the vulture circling above, before guns are drawn and everything's over in an instant. How can we add something like that to our D&D games? I've tried it with one of these. This is Kerplunk. You may remember it from when you were a kid, or something like it. It's a game where you randomly stab in these straws and then fill the top with marbles. Then you take turns pulling out the straws until marbles start dropping. You take the marbles that drop after you pull a straw, but you don't want the marbles. The person with the most marbles at the end loses, which is usually pretty obvious because there's a point when most of the marbles just all drop at once. So what if we drop this into a D&D session when a character squares off with an opponent in some kind of showdown? The player and the dungeon master roll opposed skill checks, and the loser has to pull straws equal to the difference between the rolls. The magic happens when you require the player pulling the straw to describe one of those small, focused details in the scene for each straw they pull. You manage to outpace the orc horde, but just when you thought you had time to stop and catch your breath, there's a sound ahead of you, and an orc steps out into your path. It's the leader of the band you battled before.
We have unfinished business, dwarf.
He's clearly trying to stall us.
As usual, I ignore the bard and step forward. Indeed, orc, I was sorry we were interrupted earlier. You size each other up and down, sneering as you note each other's strengths and weaknesses. Opposed insight checks. You lose by 3. I notice the orc is just as winded as we are from the chase. The orc sees the weak point where my armor was bashed before. The bard starts composing what will surely be an epic ballad.
No, he doesn't. Okay, your action.
I throw my helmet off so we can see the crazy in my eyes. You want to dance with my axe? My bard knows a few good tunes.
I'm not your bard.
Quiet. Opposed intimidation checks. I win by 5.
Okay.
You hear the cries of the orc horde in the distance. Your grip tightens on your axe. The orc grinds his teeth. Your sneer turns into a grim smile. There's a brief look of doubt in the orc's eyes.
Then, when there's a clear winner based on the marble drop, they kick off the action with some kind of bonus, like winning initiative and getting advantage on their first roll. For me, it's worked great in a showdown scene, but I think it would also work well in something more like a duel of words, where biting remarks are thrown back and forth while trying to convince or intimidate to influence a situation. Might be more fun than just calling for a persuasion roll, at least for a spotlight scene. That idea was actually inspired by another great story game called Dread. Dread is a horror role-playing game that came out back in 2005. Players take on the role of someone trapped in a story where you're forced to make hard decisions while you try to survive. When you try to take a challenging action in Dread, you don't roll dice. Instead, the game master will have you pull blocks from a Jenga tower. If you pull from the tower, you succeed. If you refuse to pull, you fail. And if the tower falls, you're doomed. You can find Dread on DriveThruRPG. I'll include a link to it and other things from the video in the notes below. What are some tips or tricks you've used to add tension to your sessions? What other childhood toys have you resurrected to add into your D&D games? Please drop a comment or randomly click on things to help continue the conversation.